The resurrection of Jesus is the most important event in the history of the world. But what does it mean? What are the implications of Jesus' resurrection? How do we understand it? And how do we understand ourselves in light of it? In this video, we'll take a look at the resurrection narrative in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. We'll consider three ways that John's resurrection narrative echoes or alludes to the creation narratives in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then we'll reflect on how that informs our understanding of resurrection as new creation. Before we dig into John's Gospel, be sure to give this video a like. And if you haven't subscribed to the Orthodoxy for Everyone YouTube channel yet, be sure to click subscribe. Now, the first echo of the creation narrative that we find in John 20 comes in the way that John frames the entire chapter up in terms of evening and morning. Mary goes to the tomb for whatever reason, to anoint the body, to care for Jesus's body. Very early, we're told, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. So early in the morning, first day of the week, in darkness. And then in verse 19, right, after Mary encounters Jesus, the whole narrative skips ahead to the evening, and Jesus appears to his disciples in a locked room on the evening of that same day, the first day of the week. So John repeats first day of the week in both instances, mentions that it's morning in the first one, evening in the second one, while it's still dark, and then evening. If we are attuned readers of John's Gospel, knowing that he has already encouraged us to read his Gospel in light of the creation narratives, right? John begins his Gospel by quoting Genesis 1. In the beginning, John says, was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He's quoting Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he wants us to read his Gospel in light of Genesis 1. And so here, he's drawing that evening and morning language that shows up again and again in Genesis 1. Evening and morning, the first day. Evening and morning, the second day. And he's inviting us, he's framing the entire resurrection narrative in terms of that morning, evening, first day language from Genesis chapter 1, which suggests that John wants us to read this as a creation narrative or a new creation narrative. That is amplified by his mention that it's still dark. Because remember, Genesis chapter 1, the opening verses, the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the earth. So we get a couple of echoes right there in the first verse and in verse 19. And it's striking that this is the most important day in the history of the world, and we don't get a single word about anything that happens while the sun is up. It's the morning while it's dark, and in the evening locked in a house. So the first echo of Genesis, of the creation narratives in Genesis, in John's resurrection narrative, is this evening morning language. Now, we might think, okay, you've got that one echo, maybe we shouldn't make too much of that. Except that John goes on to include a couple of other echoes of Genesis in his resurrection narrative. The second one comes in verse 15. Mary is still near the empty tomb. Peter and the other disciple have left and gone back home after they've inspected the empty tomb. And Mary is in the garden area, this garden tomb, looking for Jesus, looking for his body. She has not understood that he's been raised yet. She runs into someone she supposes is the gardener. It's actually Jesus. She's looking all over for Jesus' dead body, and his living body is standing right in front of her. She doesn't recognize him. She's so caught up in looking for his deceased body. She asks him, do you know where they've taken the body? I'll go get it. I'll bring it back. And we are told in verse 15, she supposes him to be the gardener. Now, she's mistaken about that. He's not the gardener. But perhaps John wants us to realize that in a certain sense, Jesus is very much the gardener. He is a gardener who is cultivating new creation. Just as the first Adam was created by God and placed in a garden, so here the second Adam, Jesus, the last Adam, has been raised from the dead, and the location where he is first encountered is a garden. So we have another echo of Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, where Jesus is portrayed as having his place of creative work in a garden, just as Adam was placed in a garden after being created. The third echo comes in Jesus' appearance to his disciples in verse 22. He goes into the room with them, despite the fact that the doors are locked. And he says, John tells us, the author tells us that Jesus says, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, so I send you." And then when he said this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." So again, you'll remember that when God creates Adam, in Genesis chapter 2, he forms him out of the dust of the ground and then breathes on him, and he becomes a living being. Now here's Jesus. The first thing he does to his disciples is he breathes on them, brings them to a new experience of life, commissions them on a mission to be his representatives, to declare forgiveness for sin and conviction of sin, those kinds of things. So again, John is picking up on themes from Genesis, bringing them forward, and deploying them in his resurrection narrative. The whole chapter is framed in terms of the morning and evening dichotomy. Mary supposes Jesus is a gardener. Adam is formed and placed in the garden after God creates him. And Jesus breathes on the disciples in a way that alludes to God breathing life into Adam after creating him. And so John is inviting us to understand this aspect of the resurrection, this implication of the resurrection. He's inviting us to see that the resurrection of Jesus means that the Creator is now at work in Jesus to bring new creation into his world. The old creation has been marred by sin and death, and it is groaning, to use Paul's language. It is suffering, it is in pain, it is in agony, and it is waiting to be set free from all of that. This is John's way of saying God has initiated his work to set creation free. He's doing new creation. He's doing that in Jesus by bringing Jesus from death to life. And now as Jesus breathes the Spirit onto his disciples, they too are participating in the work of new creation. So resurrection, one of the major implications of resurrection is that it is God's first work of new creation with the resurrection of Jesus that is now moving forward and advancing throughout creation through the ministry of the church passed down from the apostles, and it will come to its climactic moment when Jesus returns to raise the dead and rule forever. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Again, if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do that before you leave. Click like, and if you found the video helpful, be sure to share it with your friends on social media. See you next time.